Welcome to the Title IX at 50 Educate and Advocate webcast. My name is Kathy Mangano, and I am speaking today with Drs. Ed Bilik and Craig Poisson. During our time together, I will ask both gentlemen a few questions to help educate us on Title IX. Each will then share a personal Title IX story and wrap up by providing us with a piece of advice on how we can advocate to strengthen and secure Title IX. Let me begin by sharing their background information. Dr. Ed Bilik was a teacher, coach, and administrator at Springfield College for over 40 years. He was a professor of physical education, and from 1989 to 1999, he served as our director of athletics. Prior to his tenure as athletic director, Dr. Bilik coached our men's basketball team for 20 seasons, compiling a 322 and 196 record, including 18 winning seasons, 7 trips to the NCAA Division II tournaments, and 2 New England Coach of the Year honors. In addition, Dr. Bilik served on the NCAA Basketball Rules Committee, the Hall of Fame Tip-Off Classic Executive Committee, and is a coach emeritus for the National Association for Basketball Coaches. During his playing career at Springfield College, he was both a basketball and baseball standout player. In 1995, Dr. Bilik was inducted into our Athletic Hall of Fame. Dr. Craig Poisson has served as the Springfield College Director of Athletics since 2015. Prior to taking the helm as director, Dr. Poisson spent 19 years as a member of the Springfield College athletics staff and professor of physical education, including serving as the Senior Associate Director of Athletics. Since 2015, the athletics department has received several major recognitions under Dr. Poisson's leadership. Some of these recognitions include honorable mention honors for the NCAA and Minority Opportunities Athletic Association Award for Diversity and Inclusion, national runner-up for the highly coveted Jostin NACDA Division III Community Service Award, and the Division III LGBTQ Athletics Department of the Year Award. Lastly, Dr. Poisson was named the 2019-2020 Under Armour Athletics Director of the Year. Dr. Bilik and Dr. Poisson, thank you for joining me today to discuss Title IX. I have a few questions to ask you, many which are very similar in nature. And my first question is a multi-part question, and I'll ask Dr. Bilik the question to you first. My question, was the athletic department at Springfield College in compliance with Title IX during your tenure as athletic director, specifically as it relates to athletic participation opportunities, allocation of athletic scholarship funding, and allocation of resources in operational areas such as recruiting, operating expenditures, and coaches' salaries? And my last part is that if it was not, what steps did you do to ensure we were in compliance?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Let me start by saying this. When I took over the responsibility of being the director of athletics at Springfield College, our goal was to have equality between the men's and women's athletic programs. Our goal also was to have equality and equity amongst all sports. Hopefully, we accomplished this. It took some time, and basically, when I took over, I was told that I inherited a gem of an athletic program. And that statement was very, very true. However, there was no question in my mind that that gem had to be polished. And that's what we were doing with equality and equity. Now, in terms of the specific questions you asked me, can you give me those one by one and I'll address those?
Sure. Do you think we were specifically in compliance in relation to athletic participation opportunities?
Well, all I can say is in terms of our squad sizes, when we had comparable sports, we had comparable squad sizes. When we didn't have comparable sports, obviously that's what caused the differentiation in terms of participation numbers. Anytime you have a football program, your numbers are going to be larger. Our percentages in terms of the men participating in an athletic program compared to those that were enrolled, and compare that to the women who were participating in our athletic program, and as to those that were enrolled, the percentage for men was higher. I knew that. And basically what I attempted to do in my early years was to talk our women coaches into having JV programs. So we would have a higher percentage of women playing in our athletic programs. I also suggested that we start a women's golf team. And I kind of chuckle on that because I was willing to coach that team, but I could never find 7 or 8 women to organize a golf team. But we were making attempts to try to keep those participation numbers to where they were equal or close to equal.
Great, thank you on that. And I do remember the men's and women's golf program. Thank you. How about allocation of athletic scholarship funding? Now, back then we were in your early years of as athletic director, we were Division II, and we had those athletic achievement awards. How was our allocation of athletic scholarship funding at the time?
Well, as far as the achievement awards, I can't speak to the allocation of those in terms of whether they were disseminated in an equitable way. Now, the achievement award basically was based on need, and it was profiled out to the athlete. Now, we could do that when we were Division II. Shortly after I became the athletic director at Springfield, a couple of years, we went to Division III. So any inequities that were existing in terms of achievement awards were eliminated. So any inequities that may have existed before obviously were eliminated as soon as we became a Division III institution.
Can you share with us how Springfield College Athletics was in compliance in relation to allocation of resources in operational areas such as recruiting, operating expenditures, and coaches' salaries?
Well, in terms of recruiting, I can't speak to that because that was not a budget that I was in control of. I don't even know if that kind of budget existed. If there were recruiting funds available, they probably came out of the admissions office, but I can't speak to that, Kathy. I don't think that there were any funds available for recruiting. And in terms of operational expenditures, I was responsible for 2 budgets: the budget for contest management and the budget for equipment. Both of those budgets were based on either equality or equity, and we worked hard on that. In fact, this first summer after I was appointed as director of athletics, I was never given anything in writing in terms of budgets. So I had to work all summer long to develop those budgets so that they would be ready for the next academic year. Now, the third one was what?
Coaches' salaries.
Coaches' salaries, basically that was under control by the dean of student, the academic dean. Basically, the coaches, when I was there, were either tenured or non-tenured, and basically they had rank. That I think that's changed since then. But that was under control by the dean, academic dean.
Yeah. Yes, we still have the teacher coach, their faculty status, and I'm very happy about that personally. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Dr. Poison now. Dr. Poison, I'm going to ask you the same question relevant to the present situation. Is the athletic department at Springfield College currently in compliance with Title IX?
First, let me congratulate you on your appointment as the humanics professor, Dr. Mangano, and I'm truly honored to be on with Dr. Bilik, who is certainly one of my mentors in my journey in athletics administration. So thank you for having us. We believe that the athletics department is in compliance with Title IX based on the third prong. So the first prong from a proportionality statement, not much mathematically has changed from the time that Dr. Bilik was in the athletics director chair. The percentage of the men participating versus the undergraduate population of men versus the women's participation and their numbers for the undergraduate population has ranged from roughly 10 to 12% variance. And the Office of Civil Rights, we all know, has that variance at 0 after having it about 5% for many years. So from a proportionality standpoint, as Dr. Bilik noted, very difficult to achieve when you offer the sport of football, regardless of what institution you're at. The last women's sport, because they are the underrepresented gender, was added at Springfield College in 1980. So we're not meeting the mark on the second one. But I think the institution, starting with Dr. Bilik, and then there was an athletics director who I understand will have a platform in this year of celebrating Title IX in the spring semester, Dr. Kathy Schweitzer, spent 15 years in the athletic director role between Dr. Bilik and myself. So working off of the foundation of both of them, we have emphasized and implemented and revised a athletics interests survey that we believe is robust in nature. In working with our colleagues in admissions, we send to all prospective students at Springfield College, not student athletes, but all prospective students sometime in the spring term. Now, in fairness, we have not done that since the pandemic, based on resources and some personnel changes, but we do have several years worth of data prior to, and we are queued up to do it again this year. So the N is significant. I don't know what the N is, but that N goes out, and the survey is typically what you would expect from high schoolers' response. The response rate isn't fantastic, but we do get some data, and the sports that the students have checked off relative to athletics interests, by and large, we offer. Now, there are several that have been selected that we do not offer, but nowhere near the threshold that would meet a team. And in some particular sports, you also have to have viable competition. And one of the more popular sports in one year that we did the survey was women's beach volleyball. And when I say popular, there might have been 3 people that checked it off, because a lot of, as I said, a lot of the people check off sports that we already have because we have such a broad-based program. That is not surprising. In addition to checking off sports that they might be interested in, we assess their ability as well as their interest, as is written into the law. And we assess the ability based on what level they participate in their particular sport of interest at the high school, meaning do they play intramural, do they play JV, do they play varsity, or do they play at AAU/club? And we focus on the AAU/club and the varsity level, because clearly we like to think that the intercollegiate athletics program at Springfield College is comprised of elite Division III student athletes. So we think we have a pretty robust survey in place that measures all prospective students' interests and abilities in athletics.
That's great. Thank you. Looking forward to the results of that survey. How about in relation to allocation of resources in operating areas such as recruiting, operating expenditures, and coaches' salaries?
Yeah, so in some respects, not much has changed from the time Dr. Bilik to myself, in that the recruiting budget, it's interesting to hear Dr. Bilik say that there might not even been one, how much has changed in a very short period of time, really, in intercollegiate athletics, because recruitment is such a significant portion of the teacher coach's role right now in every sport. It might have led back in the day with only certain sports doing aggressive recruiting, but it doesn't matter what sport now. Recruiting is paramount to the overall experience of the student athletes at Springfield College relative to success, no matter how success is measured. Recruiting students who want to be student athletes of character. So as Dr. Bilik said, that's out of his control then, and it's out of my control now. Springfield College Admissions and Office of Enrollment Management views the teacher coaches as extensions of their office. So when they have recruiting needs, the admissions office funds it. It's not based by sport. It's not based by gender.
Right. And this, what about operating expenditures?
Yeah, those two, the two budgets that Dr. Bilik referred to, the event management and the equipment, maybe it's semantically, some things have changed, but there's still, those two are still the largest budgets of athletics that we have the control over. And, Dr. Bilik said he inherited a gem that needs polishing. The work that was done by the athletic directors that preceded me, I turned the term gem into a beach house because I happen to like the ocean. And I inherited a really nice beach house. Maybe I'm just going to put a coat of paint on it. That's my way of saying that gem needs polishing. So there's always inequities. There's always some inequities in a broad-based program as robust as ours is. But we believe we're equitable in terms of some of the things that Dr. Bilik listed: the per diem, lodging, transportation, equipment allocation, uniforms, access to medical care. I think we meet the standards for the so-called laundry list.
Great. That's I'm happy to hear that, and like your analogies of the polishing, Dr. Bilik, and for Dr. Poison, the beach. So you're talking a lot about equity. The next question is the same for both of you. Dr. Poison, I'll start with you. Equity and equality, how would you define it? And how do you execute it at Springfield College?
Well, I think the way I define it is using the verbiage that is written into the Title IX legislation that the professors at Springfield College and then the mentors that I work for reinforced over time. I've always said you strive for equality, but equity is what is measured. The most salient example that I think I have heard through my time, and also I utilized when I was in the classroom for 19 years, if it costs $450 to outfit a football student athlete at a Division III institution, nowhere in the legislation does it say you have to spend $450 to outfit a field hockey student athlete. But if you're buying new football equipment and new football uniforms on an annual basis, equity demands that you do the same for that field hockey student athlete. So I always look at it from that lens.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bilik, I'm going to ask you the same question relevant to the past. Is there anything else you'd like to add relevant to what in relation to Craig's response? Equity versus equality. How do you define it, and how did you execute it at Springfield College?
Well, that's a good question. Rather than give you Webster's dictionary definitions in terms of equality and equity, I think I'd like to give you an operational definition. I've always believed that all sports at Springfield College are equal. That's the basic premise. However, each sport has distinct differences, and it's these distinct differences that you have to deal with in terms of a fair and equitable way. Let me illustrate that point. Say we have soccer. We have a men's and women's soccer team. They're comparable sports. In most cases, their equipment budgets would be the same. And as a result, that budget would be equal. However, contrast that to a sport like Craig mentioned before, a sport such as football. In football, there is no comparable sport. Their needs, their equipment needs are definitely different, and they're extensive. They need pads, they need shoulder pads. So consequently, you can't give football the same equal budget that you gave men's and women's soccer. That will not work. you have to develop a budget that is fair and equitable for football.
Right.
Hope that
Thank you.
explains how I feel about it.
There was a great explanation on that. Thank you for those responses. My next question, Dr. Bilik, I'm going to start with you, and it is the same question for both of you. When you were an athlete, what did you witness as women were fighting for equality, Dr. Bilik?
Well, I was a student at Springfield College from 1953 to 1957. At that time, women did not have an intercollegiate athletic program. Unfortunately, their competitive needs and opportunities were met through intramurals. So basically all I witnessed was women participating in intramurals and play days. So that's about the extent of what I saw during that period of time.
Thank you. And we had the pioneers on campus earlier this year, the four first female coaches of four female coaches of the four first female teams on campus. And it was great to hear their stories about their journey. Thank you. Dr. Poison, when you were an athlete, what did you witness as women were fighting for equal opportunity?
Yeah, while I appreciate the question, it's probably an invalid question because I was never an athlete, right? Maybe in high school. So it goes back to the early 80s when I was in high school and I participated in 3 sports. And when I was in that setting, I was too young, naive to realize anything. But your question made me reflect a little bit in that 2 of the 3 sports that I participated in, there were no, and at that level, I believe the proper term is referred to girls and boys, as opposed to men and women. There was no girls soccer to my recollection. There was no girls swimming to my recollection, and there was girls track. So there was clearly an inequity in participation, but at that time, didn't recognize it, didn't see it.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question, we'll start with Dr. Poison, and it is a multi-part question again. Since 1972, progress has been made in helping women realize their promise and potential as student athletes, as coaches, and athletic administrators. Yet these gains have been made without full commitment to Title IX's mandate of equitable and fair treatment throughout collegiate sports. What role, if anything, if any, do you feel the NCAA should take to create structures, policies, or systems to identify, prevent, or address inequities? If you would like, I can make that more simple, put by saying, in sports, at all educational levels, what needs to change in order to realize Title IX's promise of gender equitable treatment?
I guess I'll respond by saying, while there's probably an argument that it could be and should be under the purview of the NCAA, I don't necessarily think that they, at this moment, and perhaps never in their history, can handle such an undertaking. I think the current state of the NCAA, they have an awful lot that they are responding to and trying to get out in front of. That is not to say that Title IX and gender equity is not of utmost importance, but I can't envision the NCAA doing the leaders' work in this area in the current state of affairs with everything that's happening in intercollegiate athletics at the moment. So I think the more direct answer to your question is it's the people that are in the position to make decisions have to realize that the law has been on the books for 50 years. And I contend that there has been great strides, but we are not there yet. But a lot of the heavy lifting was done. I reflect back on the time that Dr. Bilik referred to and some of the teacher coaches of that time who overlapped with me when I started here. Prior to Dr. Bilik's leadership, some of those things that I listed were not were not equitable.
Mhm.
I recall our field hockey coach, Dottie Zanotti, saying she had to have a bake sale to get $1 or $2 to go on per diem, where the men were getting $2 worth of per diem. That heavy lifting has taken place at 263 Alden Street because the gap was so wide 30, 40, 50 years ago. But there's still work to be done. And I think it's the decision makers on the campuses and the Office of Civil Rights that has the onus here. I can't see the NCAA having an impact.
Thank you for your response there. Yes, I totally agree. Decision makers are the key constituents here. Thank you. Dr. Bilik, this question's for you. Can you please share your perspective on the process that was taken to rectify the issue of gender equity regarding Potter softball field and the locker rooms and any other areas within the athletic department during your tenure?
Well, you're asking me to reflect upon something that occurred 23 years ago, and you were involved, so you probably have better knowledge of it than I do. All I know is you sitting in my office one time and us having a conversation about your concern that we had a chance. We were participating in a championship, and they came and looked at our facilities, and they decided that our facilities were inadequate to host that championship. Obviously, that should never have happened at Springfield College. First of all, your team earned the honor as far as that championship. And second, if you host the championship, your team has a facility advantage. That's important.
Mhm.
So in discussing this with you, I told you that this was not under my control. I didn't have the budget for it. I suggested that you see Steve Lefevre at physical plant because it probably came under his budget. I'm quite sure, knowing you, and finally seeing that the problem was resolved, you did go see Steve Lefevre and probably other people so that we would get equal facilities in terms of softball, maybe as compared to baseball. Like I could never understand why baseball needed a dugout and women's softball didn't have that same facility. I just could never understand it. That's just one example that we talked about when you came into my office. You did generate most of the work in generating that change. However, I will say that I supported you, and after you took the proper steps, I made sure that people knew that I was in support of what you were trying to get accomplished at Springfield College, because you were trying to right a wrong, and you were doing it in the proper manner. You're to be congratulated in that. And Kathy, I will say another thing. In terms of inequities that existed in Title IX, basically it was the women coaches that made the strides in terms of making the changes. They brought the inequities to the front, to the men coaches. And as a result, after some deliberation, those inequities were resolved, similar to what you did in terms of the facilities, in terms of softball. Maybe you have something to add to that, Kathy.
Well, I did share some of my journey with that process on a previous webcast, and I do want to say that you did help guide me on this, and I do know that your hands were somewhat tied relevant to the budget, and as Craig previously mentioned, the decision makers were key. The decision makers were those that were allocating the funds. So I do appreciate your support back then, and to be able to rectify some of the issues relevant to Potter Field, as well as what you did to rectify the issue with the Keith's locker room, converting it for the men's previously it was both a locker room for both for the men in both the fall and spring sports, but you changed that. And for the fall, it was for football, and in the spring, it was for softball and women's lacrosse. So I do appreciate what you did for that regarding the inequities. So thank you. So
Remember that, yeah, as I told you, that was 23 years back.
yes, long time ago. Thank you. So I have a final question on the education side of the house. Dr. Bilik, I'll ask you to answer this one first. What was your first reaction to Title IX when it passed?
Well, when Title IX passed, I was the varsity basketball coach at Springfield College. Rosencrantz at that time was coaching women's basketball, and she brought to my attention an inequity she felt existed between the two programs. She asked if we could discuss this inequity with me. I said, sure. So we sat down over a cup of coffee, and she said basically the inequity she was concerned about was men practicing at 4 o'clock and women practicing at 6 o'clock. She said basically what we should do is flip-flop that every week. In other words, the men practice 4 o'clock, women practice 6 o'clock. The next week, women practice 4 o'clock, men practice at 4. That was a bitter pill for us to swallow initially. And that was largely because we rely heavily on scouting the opponents that we were going to play. Now, the women didn't, the scouting was very limited, if they did any at all. But after a conversation that I had with Ray Gilbert, we were discussing Title IX. And at the end of the conversation, he said to me, you know, he says, I have 2 daughters, and I would hope that when they grow up, they would have the same equal opportunities as anybody else. That was my aha moment in terms of gender equity. I said, you're absolutely right. So we made the change in terms of our practice block of times. And I always respected Jane Rosencrantz for the job she did there.
Powerful statement. Thank you. Powerful story. Thank you very much on that. Craig, I'm going to switch to you, please. My final question on the educational side for you. I'm asking you to have a crystal ball. And if you could, where do you see the next 50 years playing out on college campuses and the impact on athletic programs?
Last question's a doozy. The crystal ball, I can't even see into next week, never mind next year. I mean, my response to this question, Dr. Mangano, is I think that if you ask the current high school and college age student, there's been a shift in their response to what Title IX is.
Mm-hmm.
I think for decades, the focus was athletics. And as folks on this Zoom and listening to this webinar are probably acutely aware, the term athletics wasn't in the original 37 words. How it's not under activities. But I think there's been a fundamental shift to that, which is obviously critically important, of the gender-based misconduct and inclusive
Mm-hmm.
of the sex-based discrimination. So I think so much of the future, the next 50 years, depends upon the members of Congress and who sits in the White House. You know, there is such a time of polarization and division that at some time, some legislator is going to bring back up Title IX and people are going to have their say. And on the anniversary of it this past June, the federal government and OCR put out their proposed changes to it, and the listening period has ended after 60 days. And the last time there was a listening period under the former administration, it took 1.5 years to come up with something. But I think the focus has turned so much more away from athletics and its impact with Title IX to the gender-based misconduct. So a long answer to a good question. I can't see into next week. 50 years is really hard for me to look at from a crystal ball. I would hope that the incremental changes continue to happen so that there's more equity over time. As I said, I think the heavy lifting has occurred. The large gaps have been closed, but gaps still exist. But I think a lot of it is up to the legislators.
Thank you. And that would lead us towards the advocacy component of my project. But before we talk about the advocacy component, I'd like each of you, if you could, share with us an impactful personal Title IX story. Who wants to go first?
Well, I think I told my story. I think the story that was my aha moment was the one that occurred with Coach Rosencrantz. And obviously, then my discussion or our discussion with Coach Gilbert and him saying that basically he has two daughters and he would hope that they would have the same equal opportunities. And that was it. As far as after that, I believed in equality and I believed in equity. And when I coached Coach Rosencrantz, we tried to work in that direction. And when I became the director of athletics, as I said before, that was our goal. Equality between the men's and women's program and equity and equality amongst all sports.
Well stated. Thank you very much. Dr. Poison?
Appreciative of the question, and it's a softball for me, and we don't have enough time for me to answer it. But I think my formative years were really unique in that I was raised by someone who left the athletic training field to become a director of athletics around the same time. In fact, the same time that Dr. Bilik was here, maybe a little bit before, maybe he was with Dr. Stites. There might have been a little overlap towards the end of, at the beginning of Dr. Bilik's time. But at any rate, he was an athletics director when there were large gaps in equity related to Title IX. And he was married to a female who was at that time inducted into 5 athletic Hall of Fames. She has since been inducted into at least 2 more. So my dinner conversations were incredibly unique because you had an athletic director who was wrestling with the inequities, and you had someone who was very accomplished athletically who played and competed when they told her she couldn't. So that has framed me from my formative years for sure. And I've been very fortunate and grateful to have carried that with me. And I would also like to say that even if I had not that unique background relative to gender equity, the athletics leadership team is very cautious with every decision that is made, looked at from many different lenses, including, of course, that of gender equity. So I'm grateful for the folks that are on staff at Springfield College, including the teacher coaches.
Wow, thank you. I think I would have enjoyed having dinner at your table. So we're going to wrap things up by, I'm going to ask each of you if you could provide one piece of advice on how we can advocate for Title IX. Dr. Bilik, how would you like to start?
Well, I think the way to advocate for Title IX is to demonstrate that we're in compliance with Title IX. And what I'm saying is that I feel for equity and equality and Title IX to prosper and look ahead, it's going to take eternal vigilance on each member institution of the NCAA. That is going to be their responsibility, and they're going to have to self-enforce that, their responsibility also. So I think what we need is eternal vigilance.
Great, thank you. Dr. Poison?
Yeah, I guess my response would be related to the decision makers. The decision makers at the educational institutions carry the burden and have that responsibility. And I guess my advocacy, my suggestion or my advocacy would be for the decision makers to have something that In fact, it was Dr. Bilik that first shared it with me. And I think the softball situation that you referred to, Dr. Bilik, you had said 23 years ago. You could add another decade because that was 33 years ago. And it was probably around that time when you told me this, and I've carried it with me since. The decision makers have to have the ability to think conceptually, in other words, globally, while at the same time thinking analytically, or in the world of an athletic director, unit by unit, and slowing down the decisions and seeing the impact of each decision on a myriad of criteria, including gender equity, is critically important.
Well, thank you. Well, gentlemen, this has been a true pleasure for me. I would like to thank you both for taking the time to be part of my webcast and for your leadership. You both shared some valuable insight and wisdom, and I personally would like to thank you both for all your support during my career, especially my years as a very proud teacher coach at Springfield College. Thank you very much for joining us today.